4.1 Ethical and legal issues in sports and exercise science experiments. The British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, also known as BASES, are the professional body for all sport and exercise science experiments. BASES have a code of conduct that has to be referred to, and they guide the experiment for the practitioners and researchers and tell them what is acceptable and what is not acceptable throughout the experiment. If you do take part in an experiment, you need to make sure that you use data protection, you have ethical clearance, get informed consent from the participants in the study, you act in a professional manner, and you are competent in what you are doing. The Data Protection Act is used to control how your personal information that you have given to an organization or business and how they intend to use it. Anyone who takes your data is responsible for the data you have given them and then have to follow strict rules called the Data Protection Principle. If a business or organization takes this data, they have to ensure that this information is used fairly and lawfully, used limited specifically stated purposes, not used excessively, that the information used is accurate, make sure that they do not hold on to the information of the person for any longer than needed. It needs to be handled accordingly to the people's data protection rights and kept safe and secure so that no one else sees or has access to the data. Obtaining informed consent is critical before starting an investigation or research, as without this the experiment would be unethical and illegal. Informed consent is the potential participant's formal agreement to take part in the research project. This consent form must include everything that is planned to happen during the experiment so that the participants know exactly what they will be doing so they can decide if they are willing to take part in the research. One very important thing that has to be in the consent form is the right to withdraw. If they are not comfortable during the experiment, they can take themselves out of the situation and do not have to continue in the experiment anymore. We are now moving on to the scenario analysis. This is the part of the assignment where I will talk about the scenario given and what different codes of conduct could be breached in this experiment. This scenario is an investigation of the role of the cold vest in aiding recovery from maximal sprint intervals. This experiment could cause physical harm if the participant does not know enough about the test itself and the risk involved with the vest. This would be the fault of the researcher, as it is their job to tell the participants what they will be doing during the exercise. For example, the researcher took a group of 5 adults to use the vest but had not told them how cold the vest will be and how they may suffer from this, as a result leading to trouble for the investigator. If this happens, they could end up in tribunal for causing harm to the participants of their investigation. Depending on the seriousness of the injury, they could be suspended from further research in this field. The next thing that could go wrong is that people's personal data could be released. Because of the Data Protection Act in 1998, they are not allowed to give out any of the participants' personal details. One of the ways they could do this is by writing one of the 5 adults' names on a board. This would exploit the rules and regulations of the Data Protection Act, as the investigator would be giving out the personal details of his client to other members of this group, which is strictly prohibited. This could result in a fine for the investigator and would give them a bad reputation, as they could face further legal action depending on what had happened. Another factor that could cause problems during this experiment is the consent of the participants. In the consent form, there has to be a description of the experiment and there must also be a right to withdraw. For example, if one of these 5 participants starts the experiment but does not feel like they want to continue with the testing anymore, it is their right to stop whenever they want, even if it does affect the test and your results. However, if they do not abide by this rule, it can cause serious problems for the researchers. BASES could get involved in this and take action against you, as it would put a bad name on the sport and exercise science research and could ban the researcher for any further involvement with their experiments. This study, our second scenario, is a study of attitudes to obesity in primary school children during physical education lessons. The first problem with this study is that physiological harm could occur. For example, the obese children taking part in this physical activity could be the subject of bullying for their weight, and they may have the inability to take part in certain activities. It may also make the students feel bad about themselves talking about their weight, which is not what the researcher wants. If this happens during the experiment, the researcher will be blamed for the physiological harm, as it is their experiment and should not allow this throughout their experiment. This could cause legal action against the researcher, such as fines and further precautions against them, such as bans from bases, and could get expelled from the group. The next possible problem for this experiment is the equality. The students that are taking part in this experiment may feel that the test is unethical, as they will be being singled out because of their weight. The parents of these children may also feel this is against ethical laws and could then sue the researchers for this test because of the equality issues with singling out these children due to their weight. This would end in lawsuits and a warning from bases, and maybe further action if found guilty. A third problem with the experiment is that the student data could be released, which is against the Data Protection Act. For example, they could accidentally give out personal details about the region that the student lives in. They could find themselves in a lot of trouble, as they are not allowed to give out information, as all data has to be confidential. As I said in the last slide, this could also end in a bad reputation for the researcher, and because of this, further precautions from bases due to their high reputation. They may also be banned from further research in this field. The final problem with this is the consent of the children. The researcher has to ensure that the children have read the consent form and have agreed that everything is okay before they go forward with this experiment. They cannot go on with the experiment without signing the consent form. If they do this, they could end up getting it completely expelled from bases for not following their code of conduct. The next scenario is the effects of punishment on performance of basketball free throw percentage. The first problem with this test is that it could cause physical harm. For example, if there is a group of 10 teenagers taking part in this experiment, and for every free throw they miss, they have to do 10 press-ups, this can cause physical harm to the participants because if they are continuously doing these press-ups, it could end up harming their muscles from the strenuous work they're being put through. This is a problem because in any investigation, no one should be harmed in any way, as it is ethically wrong for people to be harmed during an experiment. If this ever occurred, the researcher could end up in legal trouble with fines and lawsuits. This could then go further with suspensions from basis. The next problem is that this kind of experiment could also physiologically harm the teenagers. For example, it will make them afraid of missing the shot, which affects their physiological state during this exercise and could affect their future activity in this sport and field, which is unethical. Similarly to the physical harm, they would end up in legal trouble, including lawsuits and a ban from the current research, and could be suspended. The third problem with this experiment is that it could be deemed as an impractical test because of the punishment. The teenagers may feel that they would be more motivated to score the free throws if they were rewarded for scoring instead of punished for missing, and because everybody makes mistakes. They may feel that it is an unfair test to put them through that much because of the amount of physical strain, and it may even cause motivation problems and could cause them to lose all interest in that sport. If this was then reported to bases by the students, this would result in a removal from the current test and all research from this field in sports science for the researcher, and would not be able to be involved in that investigation anymore. The final problem with this test is the data protection issues. Just like the other two scenarios, the researcher is not allowed under any circumstance to give out the participants' personal details. For example, if they held on to the personal information of the teenagers for too long, it could put the researcher in trouble with basis, as in the Data Protection Act, it states that you should only hold on to the information as long as necessary. If they do hold on to the information for too long than they need, they could be removed from this area of research and could go further with bans from basis. We are now moving on to the fourth and final scenario, which is the effect of interval training on blood lactate values. The first problem that this test could come with is at the training level of the staff involved. For a test like this, where they will be taking blood from people to test the effects of interval training, a researcher and his or her staff have to be properly trained in this field of research and must prove this to the participants. For example, if they had a group of 8 adults, they would have to ensure that they were legally trained to deal with taking their blood and would have to prove this by showing them some kind of proof. If they are not trained and the participants find out and report them, they could be in serious trouble. They would be sent to a tribunal by BASIS to see if they were guilty of the charges. They would then be suspended from BASIS until the result of this tribunal. If they were found guilty of this, they would be fined and banned from any further investigations in the sport and exercise science field. The next problem that could come across in this test is the consent of the participant. The researcher would have to ensure that everything that is planned in the experiment is in the consent form so that the people taking part in the research know exactly what they will be doing. For example, it must be added in the consent form that they will be taking blood to test the effects of the interval training. They have to ensure that their right to withdraw is also in the consent form, so that any time during this experiment the subjects can drop out if they do not feel like doing it anymore and do not feel comfortable. If either of these things are not input into the consent form by the researcher, they could find themselves with a fine and a possible ban from BASIS for breaking their code of conduct. The third problem with this test is data protection. They are not allowed to give out any personal information as the Data Protection Act is in place to stop this. So, for example, if the researchers shared the results of one of their subjects with the rest of their group, they would have problems with BASIS due to the fact they are giving out protected personal information. This would affect the reputation of the researcher and would get them suspended from BASIS. Depending on the seriousness, there may be more legal action taken after this, such as lawsuits.